In this presentation, we will be seeing about micturition reflex. Micturition reflex can be asked as a short essay for 8 marks. Micturition reflex and cystometrogram can be asked as short answers for 4 marks. Innervation of the bladder and cystometrogram can be asked as a draw and label question. Coming to the innervation of bladder. So if you look at this diagram, draw the structure of the bladder with the urethra showing the external sphincter. So the sympathetic supply is by the hypogastric nerves and the parasympathetic supply is from the S2, S3, S4 via the pelvic nerves. And the external sphincter, the voluntary skeletal muscle, is supplied by the pudendal nerves. And remember that the dashed lines show the sensory supply. So the sensory fibers pass via the pelvic nerve and they detect the degree of stretch in the bladder wall. The parasympathetic fibers pass via the pelvic nerve and they terminate on the ganglion cells in the wall of the bladder, and the short postganglionic nerves innervate the detrusor muscle as shown in this figure. And the somatic nerve fibers pass via the pudendal nerve and they control the voluntary skeletal muscle of the sphincter. Now, micturition reflex is a reflex by which micturition or the emptying of bladder occurs. When 300 to 400 ml of urine is accumulated in the bladder, the intravesical pressure increases. This stretches the wall of the bladder, leading to the stimulation of stretch receptors. The afferent impulses are carried by the pelvic nerve sensory fibers. The center lies in the sacral segments of the spinal cord, and the efferent impulses pass via the parasympathetic fibers of the pelvic nerve. This leads to a contraction of the detrusor muscle and relaxation of the internal sphincter. Normally, the external sphincter remains constricted by the action of the pudendal nerve. Now, when the situation is appropriate for voiding, the external sphincter relaxes. How? It is by the inhibition of the pudendal nerve, and voiding of urine occurs. This mechanism is under voluntary control. Next, write about the voluntary control of micturition. So, micturition reflex is a spinal reflex which is adjusted by the facilitatory and inhibitory centers in the brainstem. The facilitatory centers of micturition, the center is in the pons, and the inhibitory centers for micturition is in the midbrain. Now, micturition is purely a reflex action in infants and young children, and with toilet training, voluntary control is gradually acquired. So, next is the cystometrogram. It is the plot of the intravesical pressure against the volume of fluid in the bladder. So, how is this recorded? It is recorded by inserting a catheter and emptying the bladder, then recording the pressure while the bladder is filled with 50 ml increments of water or air. This procedure is referred to as cystometry. So draw a diagram. It is a graph showing the intravesical volume in the x-axis and the intravesical pressure in the y-axis. So this plot is referred to as the cystometrogram. So 1A, segment 1A is the initial slight rise in pressure. Segment 1B is a nearly flat segment which is the manifestation of the law of Laplace due to the property of smooth muscle plasticity. So what is this law of Laplace? It states that the pressure in the spherical viscous is equal to twice the wall tension divided by the radius. So in case of the bladder, the tension increases as the organ fills, but the radius also increases. Therefore, the pressure increase is little until the organ is relatively full. So this is the law of Laplace. Now once the volume reaches 400 ml, there is a sudden sharp rise in pressure triggering the micturition reflex. So this plot or the graph is referred to as the cystometrogram. Then write about the abnormalities of micturition. You can write about deafferentation, denervation and the effects of spinal cord injury. So what is deafferentation? It is a condition when the afferent nerves are destroyed. So all reflex contractions of the bladder are abolished and the bladder becomes distended, thin-walled and hypotonic. This is commonly seen in tabes dorsalis, which is a form of neurosyphilis. Denervation is when the afferent and the efferent nerves are destroyed. So the bladder becomes flaccid and distended for some time. After that, gradually, the bladder becomes shrunken and the bladder wall is hypertrophied. This occurs because of denervation hypersensitivity, and this is commonly seen in tumors of the cauda equina. Next is effects of spinal cord injury. So in the first stage, during the stage of spinal shock, the bladder is flaccid and unresponsive. Then there is overflow incontinence. After that stage, when the spinal shock has passed, the micturition reflex returns, but there is no voluntary control over the micturition reflex. Then in some cases, the micturition reflex can become hyperactive. The bladder capacity will be reduced and the wall becomes hypertrophied. This is spastic neurogenic bladder. So as additional point, you can write after a spinal cord injury, the paraplegic patients can train themselves to initiate voiding by provoking a mild mass reflex. So in this mass reflex, minor stimuli like stroking the skin of the thigh can produce emptying of the bladder. So that's about it. Thank you.